Good morning. I'm Daniel Padilla-Ochoa. Friends and colleagues alike call me Danny. I'm in the Urban Ocean Project Director at Ocean Conservancy. I'm an urbanist by training and environmental conservationist by trade. I'm based out of Jacksonville, Florida, in the United States, and I've been working on the nexus of environmental protection and urbanism for the past 7 years. And today's webinar is very dear and near to my interests in daily work, and also the passion that drives the reason that we all kind of choose to do this work. I'll share some of the general housekeeping tips that I mentioned before. We've put them in the chat already. We will be recording and sharing this webinar with folks that are here today and registered but couldn't attend. As a brief overview, again, if you do need interpretation services, you can find this tab at the bottom of your screen and click the language that you desire. Please introduce yourself in the chat, and if you have questions, use the Q&A, the question and answer window, and we'll keep track of questions throughout the webinar. Okay. Today's webinar is a collaboration with a team that is leading the way in terms of advocating and providing strategies for cities to treat waste as a design flaw and make circularity a necessity in our built environment. Before we welcome our guest, Claire Mifflin from the Center for Zero Waste Design, I will provide a quick overview of Urban Ocean, our collaborative program working with cities across the world. Next slide, please. Urban Ocean is a first-of-its-kind initiative jointly implemented by Resilient Cities Network, Ocean Conservancy, and the Circulate Initiative, those three logos you see on the screen below Urban Ocean, which aims to achieve systemic transformation by working with leading cities and partners willing to invest in change and scale. Before I open up to the problematic of Urban Ocean, I would like to welcome my colleague, Malcolm Robinson Campbell, who works at Resilient Cities Network, which are hosting this webinar today. And I would like to invite Malcolm to share more about our city's work. Malcolm.
Thank you, Daniel. So my name is Malcolm Robinson Campbell. I'm a senior management for engagement in programs here at the Resilient Cities Network. That basically entails a collaboration and participation directly with city governments, but also implementation on on-the-ground programs, such as our Urban Ocean program. Our network is the leading urban resilience network. We bring together global knowledge, practice, partnerships, and funding to empower our cities. Arm in arm with our member cities, we help build a safer, more equitable, and sustainable future for all of their residents. We're a network of 100 cities in over 100 cities, excuse me, in 47 countries, 6 continents, speaking 21 languages. The way we operate effectively is that we try to empower cities to institutionalize resilience through a chief resilience officer and develop the resilience strategies. And then we promote cross-learning between cities through communities of practice and opportunities like this one for engagement with one another and technical experts in specific thematic areas. We're also on the ground delivering impactful programs such as Urban Ocean and a longer list of programs as well, including for electrification and urban public health. And we also mobilize investment for solutions in cities through different funds, and in particular, our Resilient Communities Impact Funds, which we call RCI funds. That's a basic overview of what we do. Thank you, Daniel. Back over to you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so why do we work on what we work? So first, we work on addressing plastic pollution. As things stand today, we have 11 million tons of plastic waste entering the ocean every year, with that number expected to triple by 2040, or even faster, depending on what data sets you're looking at. While awareness of this issue is advancing, there is still a considerable gap in understanding and implementation of realistic solutions. We see that across the globe on the priorities that not only municipalities are having to contend with, but also state and federal governments. And so we really need to look at stopping land-based leakage through improved waste management and reducing the amount of single-use plastic product. Our challenge is to reduce the growing amount of plastic that severely harms the marine environment, hampers our city's stormwater infrastructure, lowers our quality of life standards by compromising our water quality, our public health, and increasing greenhouse gas emissions, which are all interrelated. And so the way that we do this, next slide, please, is through a network of cities in Urban Ocean. Urban Ocean is a capacity building and accelerator program that enhances the understanding of the ocean's plastics challenge and circular economy principles, and assesses the waste management situation in selected cities to ultimately support them to develop financiable strategies and projects designed to address the interrelated challenges they identify, and then increase the participating cities' resilience with all of these efforts. The program provides a platform for cities to showcase their leadership and share their knowledge across the Urban Ocean Network and the Resilient Cities Network, as Malcolm mentioned briefly before, and it's beyond that as well, because as you might remember, Urban Ocean is a trilateral partnership, and we have partners on the ground. We have partnered with 12 municipalities across 9 countries across Asia and Latin America. And within these cities, we have built a network of local partners that work with us and the respective municipal governments to reduce plastic pollution and really change how their communities think about waste so that we can create opportunities for those working already in the sector. So if you think about the recycling sector or innovative sectors that are trying to find a different path forward, so those circular methods, so that we can think about products beyond their intended life cycle. If you'd like to learn more about Urban Ocean, you can visit any of our 3 partner websites and follow us on LinkedIn. We'll share those links and handles in the chat as we go along. Shifting gears to today's fascinating topic, how can we rethink how our cities are built to enable that transition to circular economies? It's my pleasure to introduce the Center for Zero Waste Design, an NGO that develops design strategies, advocacy campaigns, and policy tools to envision a future without garbage, where urban systems are woven into ecosystems, where people collaborate to create products and materials that are reused and recycled in circular processes, regenerating both communities and nature. Joining us from the Center for Zero Waste Design is Claire Mifflin. Claire is an architect and systems thinker with experience designing buildings to the highest environmental standards. She led the development of the Zero Waste Guidelines for New York City through a multidisciplinary collaborative process. The guidelines serve as a resource and inspiration for architects and developers to help cities reach their zero waste goals and are being disseminated and implemented through the Center for Zero Waste Design. As a certified biomimicry professional, Claire finds inspiration from natural systems that she applies to the urban environment, and her consultancy, Think Woven, works to develop those strategies to weave urban systems into the ecosystems that we're all part of. Welcome, Claire. I will let you take over from here.
Thank you very much. And yeah, thanks to the Ocean Conservancy, the Resilient Cities Network, and Circulate Initiative. As Danny said, I am an architect designer by background. I'm based in New York City, but I do love oceans. I have to say, this morning I got the train early to the ocean, Brighton Beach here, and have one of my sunrise swims. And it just reminds me how much I love the ocean and dislike some of the garbage I saw floating in the ocean this morning. But yes, this presentation is really going to be in 4 parts, starting with looking at how to move cities from linear to circularity in terms of land use. Then we'll look at the kind of infrastructure that needs to be integrated to get circular material flows in cities. We'll look at composting at the urban scale. And lastly, we'll look at how we can be collecting waste from containers rather than bags. So starting with the linear to circular, cities have been developed for the linear economy of take, make, waste. So goods or materials come into cities via ports or airports generally, and any manufacturing kind of happens on the outskirts in these large facilities, and then is kind of trucked in slightly smaller trucks to the buildings and homes in the center of the city. And then waste kind of goes out the same way to waste transfer stations and incinerators or whatever in those kind of more outskirt areas, and maybe to a remote landfill, which is often elsewhere. So if we think of that in terms of actually a map, here I've got a map of New York City, a zoning map. On the right, I have a zoning map of Mumbai. Purple is always those industrial manufacturing areas. The commercial is red, residential is a yellow kind of color. You can kind of see these larger purple areas are always kind of on the outskirts or in kind of areas on their own, away from lots of the more central areas. And it's kind of clear why that would happen. Because of pollution, of course, because of truck access, for large truck access, and to keep people away from those areas. So that kind of matches, if we kind of think of that zoning with the flow the manufacturing's kind of at either ends, and then the center is really the commercial and residential. But if we think of a fully circular city, with the circular economy, there is really no difference between new goods coming in and waste going out. It's really just the movement of materials and products that can be reused again and again. So it's a different kind of land use you need. You need more distributed facilities, which are smaller in scale and not so polluting, for repair, remanufacturing, recycling. And that has to happen kind of close to the commercial and residential areas because it's a much smaller scale. So we need more of this kind of patchwork we're trying to indicate below here, a patchwork of zoning across the city. And many of these uses, like composting, for example, aren't currently in zoning ordinances. So NRDC here did a kind of model zoning ordinance for community scale composting, saying this small scale composting should be integrated into our zoning ordinances, and it could be a primary or an accessory use or conditional use, and suggests where it could be. And I'm happy to say that New York City just updated its zoning resolution, and it does allow now composting. It's a new use group, and it is allowed pretty much at all places in the city, sometimes small scale accessory use or larger scale. So that's the kind of change that really makes it possible to get to circularity. And here on the right, I've just shown like there are underutilized spaces like under this bridge that goes from Queens to Manhattan where community composting can be integrated. And then just to also look at, we're called the Center for Zero Waste Design, but we really focused on reuse rather than recycling as a way to get to zero waste, because we believe in circularity, and that really involves minimizing consumption. So here on the left, we have a Sankey diagram, which kind of shows a very good city in terms of how much recycling and compost it is. If you get like 90% diversion of your recycling and compost and the rest of disposal, you could be like this. I think this was from Korea's data. But you see there's still a lot of consumption on the left, and there's a lot of impacts from that amount of material being wasted. Whereas on the right, we had our design. It was actually for the UN Habitat floating city in Korea, in Busan, South Korea, where we were saying we have to reuse things. So we have reusables in terms of all of the beverages, packaging. If most of that can be reusable, and even to everything you have, furniture, goods as well. And if your organics, your kind of food waste and your yard waste can all be used for compost or fertilizer and returned on site, then the amount you have going to recycling and disposal can be so much less, and your consumption can be greatly reduced as well. So that's how we try to approach zero waste. It may have some additional first costs, but it's much simpler and cheaper in the long run, and much easier to do locally. And it can also be a great way to engage communities and support green infrastructure and reduce kind of the negative impacts of trash, as we see later. So next, we're really going to look at how to get to circularity in terms of planning a city. And this kind of comes from a Put Waste to Work campaign we did for New York City, wanting New York City to do a comprehensive plan for zero waste. And so looking at the design side of that. So we'll first look into how you can design the urban environment for reuse and circular material flows. Then we'll move on to composting in particular and how that can be circular. And lastly, we'll focus on containing our waste in containers rather than bags, so waste containerization. And we have this little key in the bottom so you can see where we are in the presentation. So how do you integrate planning for deliveries and waste? We think they should be co-located as often as possible. So as you move towards this lack of distinction between new goods and waste, you have both things together. So that makes a lot of sense to have your integrated delivery and waste room in a building in the same place, or integrated in your street design in terms of picking it up. So I'm going to show a lot of these strategies, but we're only going to kind of focus on a few of them in the interests of time. But you can always go to the website Jenna posted in the chat and find a bit more about the other ones. So yeah, really having this integrated infrastructure. So say your package room in a building is next to delivery. It means that if you have your packages delivered in reusable packaging, it allows for easy take back. Same in restaurants, or reusable kegs, pallets, everything. It helps get you to reverse logistic situation. And then this is just looking at the space for deliveries here in this big residential building. We worked on this report, Delivering the Goods, which showed how you can use the same space for commercial waste collection, food delivery, residential waste collection, and parcel delivery, just by having different times when it's available for different uses. Because in many cities, the amount of traffic congestion you have from trucks stopping in the curb lane to drop off stuff and waste being collected is really disruptive to the city and adds a lot of emissions. And so having really efficient use of your curbside space is really important. We've also been doing some work with Reloop, who are a nonprofit that look at beverage deposit return systems. So we're looking at how you can integrate that infrastructure into a city. And while most deposit return systems are for single-use bottles and cans, as we see here in the right, they are also for reusables. And especially when it comes from a extended producer responsibility, EPR model, where you have a PRO, a producer responsibility organization in charge of kind of setting up the network, it kind of sets you up. So if there are then targets for reuse, they are setting up a system that can work for reusables as well. So beverage deposit return systems are common in many cities. In New York, the deposit hasn't changed since for over 50 years, and it's only 5 cents for bottles. So they're looking at increasing the deposit and looking at how it can work in a city like New York City. Currently, most of it in New York City is done through the informal sector. And so we're looking at how we can make a system that works both for canners in the informal waste sector and for residents who may want to take it back as well. And so it's a very different approach when you're in a low density context and people are just driving their cars back to the grocery store from when you're in a high density context. So we're really looking at how that would work. This is a section of Manhattan showing how all the different types of redeemers, whether those are building managers, canners, or residents or small retailers, how they would take it back. There's a very effective mobile system of trucks coming by that collect from canners in high volume, and how that could be integrated into the city. And we're suggesting, again, like I said earlier, that it's co-located with these micro hubs that the Department of Transportation is setting up for delivery. So they have these zones where you can park and do last mile delivery by hand or by bicycle. And some of these are on street, some of these are under elevated highways, for example. But it's a perfect place because there's truck access to also do the take back of the packaging. It makes total sense to co-locate it, and the Department of Transport agree on that. Next, we have kind of a suite of strategies that help promote facilities for salvage, repair, and reuse. And they range from, promoting reusable food and beverage serviceware to year-round water bottle filling stations, to hubs for repair, to a network of infrastructure for food donations. Like in COVID, there was a lot of food refrigerators, so we can not waste food that is still edible. So the one I'm going to dig into here is reusable food and drinks serviceware, because the impacts of reducing that is so large for our cities. We just see the impacts on public space, the cost to the city to actually clean all this stuff up, the litter in the city, and then, of course, the blocking of storm drains and the washing of all this public space litter to the ocean. And so typically, there are policies that can require reusable dishes and plates for dine-in, and that's fairly easy to require. Like in Singapore, it's been required that in hawker centers, new hawker centers, they have the dishwashing capabilities, so everything has to be reusable. But there can be some difficulties because there need to be washing facilities. So France required that all their fast foods had to have reusable dishware, but there wasn't washing facilities in place. So the pushback from companies like McDonald's really weakened European policies that were set to have much higher requirements for reuse in the Packaging Reduction Act. So in Aarhus in Denmark, they realized that it's actually much better to start with ensuring the infrastructure is in place. So this actually came from the neighboring town from Aarhus complained that after their big festival, there were thousands of single-use cups that washed into the ocean and to the neighboring town's beach. And so Aarhus did two things. It put a boom in those rivers, so the cups they captured them, but they also said, let's do something upstream. And they put out a bid for a company to set up a reusable cup network with stations in public space, all cafes kind of offering them, and washing facilities. And Tomra, the reverse vending machine company, won it. And it's in its first year now, but it's very successful. They use it both for festivals and for everyday use. And currently it's on track to replace about 10% of the disposable cups citywide in its first year. I'm not going to go into the other strategies in detail, but they include, larger scale infrastructure on underutilized land, like that composting we saw under the bridge, or eco-industrial facilities where you can repurpose discarded materials, having space for that, fairly central in the city, because as we said before, the distance can be a big deal. And, these are often not uses that make a lot of money. So government intervention to allow lower cost spaces or zoned for this kind of thing really is necessary. And then this is just a smaller scale. When you look at waste collection, if you zone it and give waste collection companies kind of contracts, they can kind of start to put in infrastructure to help that they get the highest value recycling and food scraps, and they make it an efficient system. We can also do policy changes at a city scale, at a building level, to make sure buildings are designed, new buildings that can better work for circular systems. And then construction and demolition waste is also a huge thing to put in policies to reduce the amount that is created. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the second section, which is about composting. Composting is something I firmly believe in at the community scale. It really engages communities to reduce and separate waste. and to make compost. And I think once people start separating their food scraps, they really begin to think about their garbage a lot more and think about, can they reduce their recycling? Can they do better in total? And there are many scales to do composting at different costs to the city. So, we like to look at providing design and operation guidelines for on-site composting. In New York City, the largest parks in each borough are now being mandated to compost their tree and leaf waste. And we're kind of giving design and operation guidelines. We're working on a grant to give those, and we'd like to suggest in many ways they collaborate with community composters. And it's great if they will accept some food scraps as well, because that engages people. But rats, vermin, odors are a real problem. So these kind of design guidelines can really help ensure that it's done not only in a space efficient way, but in a way that doesn't have any negative impacts on the surrounding environment and could be integrated into a park. And that can be incentivized, that people can compost in any green space, in a housing development, in tiny pocket parks. And there's many education and volunteer opportunities to do that. So yeah, it can be at very different scales on site, like in a school garden here, at a larger kind of community scale with volunteer label coming in. You can have drop-offs at a farmer's market, maybe with staff to help educate, or you can have unstaffed ones right here. This is in a New York City housing development, or you can have municipal collection and micro-hauling collection as well. There's so many differences and different costs to the city, but it's really a balance, between engagement, these kind of getting the community to do it, and then convenience for people who are not going to be engaged. So we really believe that community compost makes good soil, and that making good soil literally and figuratively. So it enriches the earth at a time when the world's soils are degrading worldwide, but it also makes good soil in terms of growing social bonds, civic awareness, and a healthier society. Because it's such a tangible thing that people can do, and I think it brings a lot of hope, which is so needed in these times. So we're looking at how it can partner with green infrastructure and climate resilience plans. Like New York City has goals to expand the city's tree canopy for urban cooling and cleaning the air, to increase stormwater detention and infiltration through green infrastructure, and to grow New York City's green workforce. And composting has kind of a vital role to play in all of these things. Because kind of in a broad overview, cities with gray infrastructure and pipes, that is something that's really maintained by the municipality. But when you have dispersed green infrastructure in terms of parks and street trees, you need to engage communities to maintain them. That's not the kind of, it's too labor intensive and dispersed for the city to maintain so much. So really engaging people to maintain all your green infrastructure is necessary, and composting is a really good way to do that. So we look at how it can be used locally for that, and how you can have urban agriculture as well on rooftops and include composting in that. So, for example, in Philadelphia, they are looking at working with community composters to use the compost, and then they're combining it with sand, which is actually made from waste glass, because sand is another thing that's expensive and there's a shortage of, and there's excess waste glass. So they're grinding up these bottles, adding it to the food scraps, and making a soil that works really well. And they've been studying that, landscape architects, and they're loving this topsoil that is made right there in the city. Vienna also makes a peat-free soil from organic waste, which is collected by the municipality. Here in Seoul, they have rooftop gardens that often use food scraps, which are managed in vessel, dry aerobic biodigesters or dehydrators, and then kind of composted and added to the soil, or cured and added to the soil, I should say. And the lastly thing that we shouldn't forget is just how much healthier playing and working in compost is. There was a Finnish study that showed in just 28 days, if kids played for a month in healthy soil, it increased the strength of their immune system response. And also, if you're growing vegetables, you're going to eat more healthy. Vegetables grown in compost-rich soil are much richer in minerals and healthier than those grown in depleted soil or with only synthetic fertilizers. And then on top of those benefits, there are also many social resilience and mental health benefits from communities coming together to garden together. So I could go on for days about the benefits of compost. I have only one more slide, but compost used for stormwater infiltration. Because many cities, like New York City, have spent billions of dollars on rain gardens and infrastructure to infiltrate and to hold back stormwater because we have combined sewers. Compost can hold 6 times its weight in water. And, you know, if you add compost to your neighborhood parks, it can allow them to absorb like up to 80% of a 4-inch rainfall. That's about a 10-centimeter rainfall. And here is a park right by me after heavy rain, and just showing how it isn't infiltrating. And compost isn't added to this park, but if it was, combined with maybe a few trees at the low point to let that water really sink down, then we wouldn't have this situation where the park has turned into a pond. And there's a lot of damage that is created in parks from this stormwater not infiltrating. And then, of course, these green spaces can act as sponges, so there's less flooding in buildings surrounding them. And then compost adding to street trees can really increase the health of the trees, and then that keeps the air cooler and cleaner, and again, is really helpful. Actually, maybe Jenna, you could add the link to the Bloomberg City Lab article there, which kind of goes into detail about how compost can really help the city. And now, in this final section, I'm going to look at waste containerization. And you can see why, because in New York City, our waste is collected in bags. So we have these huge piles of bags in the city. It may take this sanitation truck there half an hour. This is in the financial district, to load all those bags by hand into the back of the truck. Traffic is backing up. People are frustrated. There's rats. When the bags are taken, there's litter that's left. It's just not a good system. And we've been advocating since the Zero Waste Design Guidelines in 2017 for New York City to containerize its waste, because, yeah, here again, not really a nice place to be dining on the street. So the city is now starting to look at it, but unfortunately, it's only going to containerize for trash, which, if you just do plan for trash, you'll get more trash. So it'll bring the city further from its circularity and zero waste goals. We think the approach should be try and reduce waste first, and then when you do waste containerization, make sure you do it in a way that you can really separate your recycling and compostable waste from it. So there's many things you can do. You can promote the use of on-site equipment. Singapore has some rules for that. For large food service providers, have to put in equipment to dehydrate or pulp or or manage in some way, even convert to biogas or fertilizer for on-site food scraps. And you can also reduce the impact of cardboard on our streets And you can require that new buildings are designed for these containerized waste systems and centralized waste places. This is a diagram that looks at one of the underlying principles we believe is really necessary for better separating waste, which is equal convenience disposal. Cities that have kind of a central waste room where you can dispose of everything together in your residential buildings, like in Taipei, for example, it's, you know, if you're not disposing of waste, say in New York City, it's often every story of a building, you could throw away your waste. And maybe it's trash on your floor and you have to take your recycling and food scraps to the basement. Similarly in Hong Kong. That is not going to incentivize you to recycle if it's less convenient. And the other thing is having a central waste room allows you to see your neighbors when you throw away your waste, and you see, oh, look, they're doing composting, and you talk to them, and there's kind of a social component around recycling and food scrap separation. So I think that is part of the part of why equal convenience disposal also works. Similarly, like in an office, you don't all have a desk bin. You have like a central waste station, as shown here, where you can throw everything away together. It really leads to better separation. And not only for your occupants, you need to make it work for your staff. So you need to ensure they have enough space to keep the waste separate once they've collected it. And then you have to figure out how it's collected by the hauler as well. So really getting designers of buildings to make sure they're planning their buildings to separate and keep waste separate at a building scale, and similarly for municipalities at a more urban scale is key. So that's why we think waste containerization can't be done for trash only, keeping recycling in bags and food scraps, whatever. It needs to be done for all streams so people have equal convenience for all of them. And there's many different ways you can do it. You know, you need to ensure that if waste can be kept in the building, it is, as long as possible. You need to reduce the impact on streetscape. You need to look at your truck fleet and how much you might have to retrofit it, or even need new trucks and that expense. So we've been doing a lot of work on waste containerization, and we've been doing research across the globe to see how other cities containerize their waste, and there are so many different systems. But it really is a spatial issue in high density cities, and there's different solutions for different urban forms and densities. So here on the left, we see in Vienna, they put a lot of recycling into these four-wheeled bins on the street. Some of the trash and cardboard is collected from within the buildings with bins that are wheeled out and back. And in the street, they have food scraps, packaging, and metals and clothing and other waste streams. And we often see these kind of compound systems, which aren't true equal convenience disposal, but it's fairly co-located in terms of the recycling streams on the street. So these wheeled bins, the good thing about them is the trucks, the same truck that is just your rear loader truck for bags, can also take two-wheeled bins and four-wheeled bins. And those bins may be, like here in Paris, staged temporarily. These bins were inside the building, the staff left them out, the truck comes and takes them. Similarly here, this is Vienna again, tipping some of these temporary four-wheeled bins. So this is a solution that works for a lot of cities because it doesn't require a big upgrade, and it can be used for temporary bins or permanent bins. In Italy, they have access controls, so you can stop illegal dumping into those bins through use of a key fob or card, and it's a great solution. Another method that's really common in Europe and South America is these side loader containers. In the middle, we see actually hoist containers as well, which Barcelona seems to have every system. But these side loader containers are a lot cheaper than the hoist containers, but a little less space efficient. You have to have more space between them. And the thing about the side loader containers is you have to have left-handed trucks and right-handed trucks. So there's a little more complication in how you do your routing and how many trucks you need to have. Hoist containers, while more expensive, are a little more space efficient, and they're good for heavy streams like glass, for example. They open at the bottom rather than the side lid here. So there's a lot of choice if you're going to retrofit your truck fleet for them. Hoists, you can sometimes use existing trucks and then just add a hoist. I know they did that in Kissimmee, Florida. So there's options here. In New York City, they're buying some new trucks, and this will be the first in the US of these side load trucks to pilot some of these as well, but only for trash. And we think they should actually be using them. They're using them for the large buildings. We think they should be using them for the smaller buildings where they're requiring these two-wheel bins. But as you see, it can really have a bad impact on streetscapes because these walk-ups above, these apartments don't have space for the bins. So they're kind of crowding the sidewalk. So I think in this kind of density, it makes sense to do what the lower European density cities are doing with shared bins in the street for all types of waste and recycling. So we can use our sidewalks for walking on or eating or whatever. So this is just, some of the work we're doing with New York City is suggesting how waste can be containerized in different densities, in different ways to improve streetscapes and help get to circularity. So this is what I just showed. Instead of bins on sidewalks for low density, with like containers on the street. For high density, where the city is suggesting that the bags from a trash chute get brought up and be put in permanent containers in the parking lane, we think this makes no sense. It's not good for labor to be lifting them all. It takes permanent use of the street, when you could instead just have that chute go into a four-wheeled bin and set them temporarily in a delivery zone, like we were talking about earlier, which could be used for deliveries later in the day, and then those bins just go back inside. So really, our approach is first, take space in the building if it has it. If it doesn't have it, like this type of building doesn't have it typically, take place in the street, but be as space efficient as you can. And to be space efficient, you will need to adjust collection schedules. Higher density areas should be collected more frequently. If you do collect food scraps more frequently than trash, you can kind of incentivize that. That is a smelly, problematic stream. So just looking at how you can balance and incentivize what you want to be done. And then looking at how to integrate them into the streetscape. Obviously, the most expensive way is to have these shared waste containers that are submerged into the street with a hoist truck. They do that in the Netherlands, in The Hague, and in many places in Amsterdam, but it is a costly solution. It was ruled out in New York City. One thing that isn't costly is to kind of have centralized collection facilities. And some developments in New York City have this, where waste is brought, like a last mile delivery, is brought by hand. They push the waste to a central roll-off container. And we've seen that in other small cities as well. For example, in Roanoke, in Virginia, they have that, where they wanted to get rid of the bins in the downtown neighborhood from restaurants. So they have the restaurants can take them to this shared roll-off container at any time. And that's a lower cost solution, and one that improves streetscapes. And then the kind of integrating drop-off sites for waste that isn't collected curbside, whether that's textiles or food scraps or whatever, kind of integrating places people can take them into the public realm. And so I think we're going to have a poll now coming up to ask you, I've kind of given you an overview of the 3 categories and to ask you if you'd like to know more about any of them. We could hold another webinar if some of these topics are something you'd like to dive a little deeper into. So I'm just going to wait a moment to do that poll, and then I have 2 finishing slides, and then I'm ready to take any questions. So yes, you can start putting any questions you have in the Q&A, please, and then we'll take them with the time we have left at the end here. Okay, while we're finishing the poll, I'm just going to finish up the questions here, the slides here, sorry. So one thing that really occurs to me is that circularity affects the urban form of our cities so much. It's like, this is what a linear city looks like. This is actually around the corner from me, like a mini storage place, these buildings that are full of unused things and no people in them. And there's another one across the street. Or fulfillment centers, and our streetscapes kind of taken up with so many deliveries, bigger trucks, litter all over the place. And this is what a linear city looks like. But if we can go to more circular cities, the urban realm can just be transformed. If trucks don't have to go everywhere, but instead we have last mile delivery and collection by micro haulers and low impact vehicles, that has a real impact on our streets. We can have streets that look like this, that have stormwater infiltration built in, that are pedestrianized, because we don't need to have so much for trucks to come down. Maybe these people take their waste to the end of the street, and you engage people, because there's no way we're going to get to circularity and zero waste without really engaging people and bringing people hope. And so engaging people in repair, reuse, composting, it's just such tangible things that make sense to people and gives them hope, and has a kind of virtuous cycle effect to catalyze the change in our cities. So, libraries engage people, green stewardship, fixing repair. That's the kind of city we want. So I'm going to end there, and hopefully there's a couple of questions we can take.
Thank you so much, Claire. We do have a question about compostable disposable foodware. And so if there's information about the quality of the compost that they produce, and the true compostability of them.
Yeah, I can answer that. I mean, there is BPI certification. Compostable disposable foodware is a real issue. And the main problem that was uncovered recently is the PFAS, which is because they have to be lined to be made waterproof generally. So they're lined with this kind of lining that has PFAS, the persistent chemicals in it, and that's a problem. So a lot of composting facilities no longer accept compostable stuff because they don't want that problem. Some countries are kind of phasing out. I mean, if you don't accept, if you make people use the PFAS-free compostable products, they are compostable. Here in New York City, we have an island, Governor's Island, that they make all the vendors on the island use BPI certified compostable products. And there's a community compost organization, Earth Matters, that composts them and shreds them. And they've been testing their compost, and it does create good quality compost. But There's a lot of studies, like from Upstream, Reuse Wins is a great study that really looks at how reuse is so much better than compostables. It saves costs. We've been talking to vendors of reusables that say it saves, in general, they're providing them on college campuses. It saves the college 50% of costs. They pay the reusable service instead to provide all the reusable containers, and they save 50% of costs just in that monthly, because compostables are very expensive. So yes, theoretically, they can be composted. It's not that valuable, and to the composter to have it, none of them say, give me more compostables. It's a pain for them, but they can do it. But I would say the other thing is, like at a municipal scale, if you're screening out plastics, which most municipal scale collection is, you have to screen out plastics and contaminants. They can't tell if it's compostable or plastic. So they screen out every cup, every container. So it goes to landfill. And in landfill, it's not good. It decomposes and gives off methane. So I'm not a huge fan.
Yeah, I would second that, in that we really want to think about how do we cut that linear cycle, right, as much as we can. And another thing there to consider as well is the emissions from just manufacturing, even compostable silverware, right? It's the idea that we can continue fabricating and then we can find a way for that waste to be minimized. But those greenhouse emissions from fabrication are still there. And so the
Yeah,
only really way to
totally.
cut that is
I
keep
mean,
things in use.
yeah, and it's cheaper and simpler,
Mhm.
and you're not having to collect all that litter. But yeah, and it's a systems change that we need. So yes.
Agreed. There's so we have a few questions. There's one in the chat from Socrates who mentioned that in essentially in urban context that sprawl is more prevalent, right? So across the United States and most continents across the world, really, sprawl is the name of the game in terms of new development. How do we think about circular economies and circular flows for materials in places that don't have the density kind of benefit, if you will?
I mean, I think it's often a similar way of thinking of it, but you don't have that focus on the spatial issues that we're focused on a lot as designers, because you just have more space for it. So in a sprawl situation, you can be composting in your backyard. There's a lot of advantages, in fact, for some things like that composting, but in terms of sharing, all those take back, all those other things, I'd say co-location is the key. So you want to locate things like where people are going to buy food that they can take stuff back. So it's the same kind of principle of co-locating things so you can have circularity, but it's just at a more distributed scale. But I think the same overall principles apply.
I would agree, and I think so. I live in a not as dense city, and I have kind of throughout, if I think about it really, and you do have the leverage of the vendors, right? So as this is different in a highly dense city like New York or in Hague or in many of the major metropolitan regions. You have a variety of vendors that you can then kind of see who can get closer, as a race, if you will, to circularity. We did see something that is analogous to that in South Florida, Miami Beach in the US, where we essentially tried to figure out how we can get vendors to then figure out what are the materials that they're bringing into the city and how can we phase out single-use plastics so that we can be more adaptable to that market. And that effectively works. So I would say that is part of the solution. And another set of questions that really target how do you engage, right? So well, how do you make it part of not just the municipal and kind of official communication channels, but how do you ingrain it into the social contract, if you will, of the folks that live in these cities? And then through that engagement, how do you reduce contamination, right? Like apart from signage, is there any other things that are necessary for engagement to work and for contamination to be reduced?
Yes, I love that question about engaging and having the kind of storytelling and the arts themes. totally agree that that's really important. I kind of love the artist in residence programs that like San Francisco has had, New York City has had with their waste departments, where you have an artist that is working with waste to make art as a kind of residence. But I think all of them, all of the storytelling, anything you can do to engage creativity to help people get to circularity is key and just as important. I'm sharing what I'm working on as an architect and designer and what we're working on here from our point of view, but it's just a small part of the puzzle. And I agree, the creative part is just as important. And really there are people doing amazing things in New York City, whether that's educating people to compost through rap and hip hop, or through so many different ways. And then I guess the second part of your question, Danny, is kind of tied into the signage question, right? And the labeling. And again, I think there's ways to, that's key to make sure that people put things in the right bin, is clear visual, clear clues, clear signage. And you have to engage people because you have a few seconds to kind of communicate what goes where. And so if something's well designed and done well, I think it can make a much better influence on people to do the right thing. So kind of tying in everything together to connect them. So people engage to do the right thing. It's very clear how to do the right thing. It all needs to tie together.
One follow-up question there, and it really is tying into the policy changes, right? So one of the issues with contamination rates is that we have just an almost infinite number of different material kind of compositions for the things that we're supposed to be kind of recycling, that we're supposed to be taking out for organics, etc. And so tying this into land use and zoning and policy, how have you seen that those kind of work hand in hand, right? Like, so this reducing contamination rates, working on the policy side to be mindful about the materials that the city is able to process, and then tying into it, how does land use and zoning help you kind of make that strategy? Do you identify specific places that have higher density or lower density so that you can test out the efficacy of policy and then moving from there?
Yeah, it would be great to be able to test out policy in that way. I think, obviously EPR bills and things that make producers kind of responsible for their packaging make a lot of sense. And if you can combine them with kind of incentivizing them to do that, deposit return systems that can or reusable systems, that can really help, because you're right, there's so many different materials and it's so complicated to know what goes in the right bin that you can't hope that people can do it perfectly, so without making some change upstream. So that's why I think starting with kind of closed systems, stadiums, events, and really moving, or food halls, really moving them towards reuse, and bit by bit showing that it can work at a closed system scale, and then kind of taking it to more of a neighborhood scale makes a lot of sense. And at the same time, just trying to reduce the amount of proliferation of different materials, which of course is very difficult to do, but there can be incentives and policies that work. Of course, pay as you throw is another one to really often incentivize people or buildings just to set systems up to make it easier to create less trash. But yeah, it's complicated because there's so many scales. Some policies can't be done at a city scale, have to be done at a national scale.
Yeah, and that's a battle we often see throughout the cities that we work in, is this tension between the national scale and what the city wants to do and needs to do to handle their material flows. Because at the end of the day, it's the city that has to manage their landfills, the recycling infrastructure. And a very quick question, and then we would close this out, from Anaí in the Q&A. For the examples of the reusable cups that were showed, were they made of plastic or metal?
I'm trying to remember which cups I showed. There are, the ones in Aarhus are made of plastic. Yes, there are systems that use either, but those ones are plastic. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Claire. And with that, we will close this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Very much appreciate your engagement and your attendance. Claire, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and the work that you are doing and supporting. Please stay tuned for more information and have a great day.